welcome everyone. Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health, and we're going to continue our exploration of thyroid challenges. And we're joined by Dr. Alan Christianson, who is indeed one of the world-class experts. In fact, so much so I'm convinced that I invited him to be the primary consultant for our new health coach, which is still in development and yet to be released, and even beta, but it will be released shortly. Hopefully in a month or two, might be a little longer. We can't release until it's really good, and it's not there yet. So once we have that, we're going to be able to provide these protocols and basic steps and a whole wide variety of other things. But we really need the best of the best of the best when it comes to comprehensive knowledge and understandings of all these different disciplines. And that's why we're spending so much time on the thyroid, because it's important to get it right. And Dr. Christiansen has spent over 3 decades getting it right. Yeah, he's not,
trying to get less and less wrong.
Yeah, less and less wrong. Yeah, that's a good point. Less and less wrong. That's one way of framing it. So, maybe you can summarize some of the things that we reviewed earlier, but we'll have links to the previous interviews. We've done 2 now. And, these will be this information really is going to change. This is not a rapidly evolving science, and in some of the disciplines that we have, where it's changing pretty regularly. But I mean, there's some modifications. Certainly, you can share this with them, but this is going to be pretty much evergreen. So if you follow these principles, it'll work. And before I let Alan take over, I am going to share my experiences, because when he first came on, I was just astonished. Never knew this information and was searching. I knew intuitively. I trusted myself to understand that I did not know thyroid, but I did not know anyone who knew thyroid, because when I tried to talk to them, I didn't feel comfortable that they had the big picture, because using the conventional approaches on thyroid, and I'm just talking about conventional medicine, I'm talking about natural medicine, alternative medicine, the people who ostensibly know this and are using natural thyroid replacements, and they just don't understand the foundational reasons why most thyroids go south. And it's really pretty simple. And this is a principle that I've learned throughout my career. The wiser you become, the more you understand and realize that the simpler the solution is. It's really pretty simple. And we'll go over that again. But the reason I'm mentioning it here is that I personally integrated these strategies, because at the time I first interviewed Dr. Christianson, I was taking a product called NutriMed, which is a decent product. It's a form of desiccated thyroid. And I was taking 2 of those, which is a significant dose. And I was taking 5 microgram cytomels a day. So that's just a pretty hefty dose. And because I understood that the problem was too much iodine that was causing the autoimmune thyroiditis that causes your thyroid not to work like it's supposed to, and was basing my impressions on faulty labs like TSHs and basal body temperature, was essentially outdated information that's a century-year-old, then I realized, well, I didn't have to worry about these things. I was just trying to be diligent and do the best I could, but I was actually making myself worse. And so literally within 2 weeks of my first interview, I was off of all those medications, and I have no problems or complications at all.
That's great.
But I'm never going back on those again. So needless to say, I'm delighted. It's not common for me to find someone of Dr. Christianson's stature of knowledge in an area that is really, I don't think is exceeded by anyone that I know personally. Now, there may be others out there, but I think he's the top banana. So with all that said, why don't you summarize some of the things? Again, we have 2 previous interviews. We'll have the links. So if you want to see the whole thing, go there. But we'll give you a quick summary, and then we'll go into some other topics.
Well, quick summary, yeah, thyroid problems are very common. Thyroid autoimmune disease is the most common autoimmune disease by a lot. It's on the increase. Thyroid cancers are the fastest increasing types of cancers. So this is a real problem globally. Thyroid medications are among the most top prescribed medications. And the high-level idea is that both the conventional and the natural world assumes that the problem is that there's an empty tank, that the body can't make something it needs. And so the conventional world uses one medicine, the natural world uses different medicines and at different ranges, but they're doing the same kind of stuff. And it turns out the medicines aren't harmless. So yeah, when you're taking something, even if it's the same thing your body would make, you're not at the same state as someone would be who made it themselves. So thyroid disease is different from a lot of other conditions in that it's genetically correlated with the body's iodine tolerance. So yeah, there's age, gender, genetics, and then iodine intake as far as the four main causal factors. And the cool thing is that most people with some version of thyroid disease, whether it's Hashimoto's, levels of hypothyroidism, different versions of Graves' disease, in most cases, just getting a handle on iodine intake and getting it back to a safe, reasonable range can reverse the problems for most adults.
So thank you for that summary. I got a quick follow-up question that a friend of mine asked, because, and this is a massive confusion I had before our first interview, is that I made the assumption and it's valid. It's not outrageously foolish, but it's an autoimmune disease. So I thought all autoimmune diseases had the same pathogenesis, the same reason why they developed. And that is not true. Thyroid seems to be relatively unique in its form of why autoimmunity is activated. It's not the same as most of the others, almost all the others, as far as we know, like rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis and inflammatory bowel disease being the big ones, but there's certainly many others. And those are all result from a damaged gut, leaky gut, so to speak, and these proteins, because of these holes, essentially literal holes, micro holes in the system, they leak through, go into the gut, and these proteins are in your blood, so your body responds and reacts to it. And if it's similar to your tissues, bingo, you're impacted. But that's not what happens with thyroid. It's a different mechanism. So you're the one to help me understand. So why don't you describe this? And then I have some questions about it. This is the autoimmune hypothyroid, Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Yeah. So simple thing, we require iodine. It's not the villain of the story. We need some. But humans are adapted to two different ecosystems, basically coastal or inland. And coastally adapted humans can do great on a moderate to high range of iodine. Inland adapted humans do fine on a lower intake of iodine. And many people still have the genetics for inland adaptations, even though about 30 to 40% of the population consumes amounts that are just too high for that. So when there's excess amounts, the extra iodine creates more free radical stress. It causes the immune system to think that normal parts of the thyroid are foreign and starts to attack them. And in this case, it's pretty exciting because that's the big driver of it. But thankfully, it requires an ongoing trigger, an ongoing insult. So when you can break that cycle well enough, the immune system realizes that, no, this was not the problem. And most people can have that calm down.
Yeah, it's shockingly how fast this resolves. I mean, most autoimmune disease is a long haul. We're talking months at the quickest and years typically or more. But this is just a few months. It's like 1 to 3. In my case, it was, well, I think you can confirm clinically that it's over when your immunoglobulin or your antibody levels decrease. And mine were mildly elevated at 1.4, and I have not done a retest yet, but I suspect it'll take a few months to come down.
Antibodies are really weird in this case. They roughly approximate the autoimmune process, but not perfectly. Many people with autoimmune thyroid disease never have measurable antibodies. And there's a subset of people with mild elevations of antibodies that have no thyroid problems. But on aggregate, marked elevations of antibodies do correlate with thyroid autoimmunity.
Okay. And in my case, it was thyroglobulin, because there's two, that and then
Those are the main two.
thyroid peroxidase. Yeah. So is there any evidence there's a correlation with these diseases, even though they have a different etiology? These traditional autoimmune diseases, like another one would be B12 deficiencies, pernicious anemia. So is there any connection with that, so that people might have decreased B12 levels?
Fascinating question. So there's a thing called thyrogastric syndrome, also called atrophic gastritis or autoimmune gastritis. And that's present in about 30 to 40% of people with autoimmune thyroid disease. That's a comorbidity. So it's not caused by thyroid disease, but it correlates with it. The two often go together. And with that, the autoimmunity is against the parietal cells of the stomach. And yeah, that can lead to, as the disease progresses, it can lead to poor absorption of iron, B12, and zinc, generally in that order.
Does you have any speculation or idea why that might be that? Because it just doesn't seem to be connected to iodine.
No,
But
probably not
yet
related to
there's an
iodine.
association there. Just
Yeah.
is this a coincidence? It's a coincidence.
Well, our best guess is that there's certain genes of autoimmunity that are more specific to thyroid disease, and some that are more general to autoimmunity overall. And so it seems that those with some combination are apt to get thyroid disease, and they do have higher risks of other autoimmunity also.
Okay, so uh, in someone with that combination, would they have? Is it also uncommon to see or common to see a elevation of liver enzymes, like a mild hepatitis?
Sure. So yeah, specifically metabolically associated steatohepatitis or fatty liver, we call it more
Mm-hmm.
commonly. There's a lot of overlap between that and thyroid levels. So hypothyroidism. Many ways the thyroid hormones have regulatory roles on liver function. And then also body weight, blood sugar metabolism, overall metabolism. Because of all these things, yeah, there's a high overlap between hypothyroidism and then fatty liver.
Okay, so that it's your speculation is the fatty liver, and which, in my view, we had a phone call within the last week, actually right before I had my surgery, I believe, which was just less than a week into that now, and I'm actually going to interview the surgeon who did my surgery for me, but and I remember during that call that we had that we discussed this right before we I hung up. I had to hang up because I hang up as I was back home. And it appeared we have different views on this. And I really wanted to explore this. So one of the reasons why I invited you back, because I thought I understood it, but I thought I understood thyroid before I talked to you too. So I'm hoping for shifting my views because it's all about the data and understanding it, And I think you acknowledged on my ability to do that and pivot in a dime because I don't have stakes in the ground for any perception. I just want to know what's correct. So by understanding of fatty liver disease, which I think is the most accurate, previously called NAFLD and now called MAFD or MAFLD. Is it MAFL? Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And sometimes they throw an S in there. But my understanding is that it's an excess, primarily related to an excess of omega-6 fats, which I think is one of the primary cores of almost all disease. And if you address that, you'll get better, but certainly it won't fix your thyroid if you're taking too much thyroid hormone. So it's not the whole banana for sure, or enchilada, but it's a big part of it. And there are other metabolic poisons than this, certainly alcohol being one. Interesting, I did an interview with CBS News yesterday, and there was the Surgeon General put an announcement a few days ago, that at the end of last weekend, actually a few days ago, that said that alcohol is now recognized as a cancer-causing agent, and actually the Surgeon General in the U.S. has adopted that, but the IARC, the International Agency for Researching Cancer, I think it's a division of the WHO, has identified it as a class 1 carcinogen. I mean, it causes human cancer. So clearly, if it's going to cause cancer, it's not going to be great for the liver. So, what I shared is that's a metabolic poison, very similar to vegetables oils, because both of those, the metabolic byproduct of alcohol is ethanol, so is a primary term. That can mean any beverage, whether it's beer, wine, hard liquor. Is acetaldehyde, which is a reactive aldehyde. It's a very small molecule. I think it's only 2 carbons, I believe. But it's a reactive aldehyde, and so are all the damaging oxidative metabolites of linoleic acid. They're reactive aldehydes. So they had that same pathway. They increase calcium influx into the cell, which causes superoxide and nitric oxide to combine with peroxynitrite, which is a really potent reactive nitrogen species that just damages your DNA, your cell membranes, your proteins, your fats, mitochondria, stem cells, you name it, it's damaging it. And this is one of the primary reasons why it's so dangerous. It not only causes cancer, but heart disease, diabetes, obesity, the whole shebang, and certainly fatty liver disease. So that's my perception of it, and why I think it. And I really, you started to explain your concept, and I was really intrigued with it. So maybe we can take off where we left off on our conversation.
Sure. And I should frame all of this that my last deep analysis on the molecular mechanisms of fatty liver was about 2018. Last time I did a pretty comprehensive analysis on this. And at that point in time, they were talking about basically you could simplify it and think about it as a fuel molecule, acetyl-CoA. So a step down from aldehyde, a step down from alcohol, ketones, triglycerides, carbs, all these things, linoleic acid. All these things, the common thread is that they can be used as fuel molecules. And the body's got this fuel balance based upon how much it's using, how well it's using it, and how much it has. And so when that point is exceeded, when the body is past some fuel threshold, then it has to go into a fuel storage mode. And people differ in terms of where they store fuel and how safely they can do so. Some extreme examples are like sumo wrestlers. They do some pretty elaborate mechanisms to have almost all their fuel stored as subcutaneous fat. And these guys are big, but they're athletes. They're metabolically healthy. Now, the other extreme, there are some people who are of normal weight, but are still having prediabetes, fatty liver, and all these problems. They're doing a very poor job at where they're partitioning their body's fuels. So yeah, there's all these different fuel molecules that ultimately, if they're not metabolized well, they get stored in somewhere that can be harmful. And in the liver, that's one place. So the liver has two compartments. There's triglyceride and glycogen. And there's a certain balance needed between the two of those to burn stored levels of triglyceride. And triglyceride can occupy a lot of space. Glycogen can't. There's only a few areas where it can go. And so the pathogenesis, to my reading back in 2018, of the main mechanism of fatty liver is that the proportions of triglyceride exceed those of glycogen. And now there's this vicious cycle to where triglycerides can still be made and deposited, but the process can't reverse very readily. And definitely linoleic acid, other fat, many things can be involved in that process as far as creating that excess fuel.
Okay, so now I understand it, because the first time my head was spinning because I thought I knew it, and then I was like taken for a surprise. But I think that what I just shared, they both merge together. It's just as a more detailed explanation of the pathology that happens. I was attributing it to peroxynitrite, but that still could be an explanation, because ultimately it poisons your system, decreases total body cellular energy, and you need energy to get these systems back online.
Right.
And that ultimately could be what happens when the energy is exhausted. And, so it's a secondary impact as a result of the primary.
Well, and how I describe that model is simply why alcohol can also be a problem, and also why some people are more affected than others.
The same thing. Yeah. They are almost cousins, if not even brothers and sisters, really siblings, with respect to their pathology. Alcohol is not fat, but it's similar.
Well, and fructose goes in the mixture too. So so many different sources of acetyl-CoA.
That's a different mechanism, though. That's a different mechanism completely.
But ultimately, it's acetyl-CoA deposits.
Yeah. So speaking of acetyl-CoA, that reminded me of another area I am researching. And really, I don't know if we discussed this, but I'm really fascinated with this topic because it relates to gut health. And it's widely adopted, and almost every researcher agrees, sort of by consensus, that butyrate is the best fuel for the colonocytes, the colonic epithelial cells. But very few people. I was doing some deep dives in this because this is a bit fascinating area of research for me. This is really optimizing the gut microbiome. And I just made an assumption that butyrate was the most produced fat from the microbes that make it. And these microbes are different. These are called beneficial bacteria. The ones that are almost decimated by everyone. There's very few people who have a healthy microbiome. Even though they think they do, they really don't. And it's because of this metabolic poisons, pervasive use of linoleic acid, other poisons, alcohol, certainly, but plastics, EMFs, endotoxins from the pathogenic bacteria, and they all go in there and they essentially kill off these good guys. And these good guys are the ones that make the short chain fatty acids, butyrate being the most common. But did we just discuss this on our call?
We did on the call. I don't know if it was on the podcast or on the call or when that was, but we did talk about this a little bit.
Okay. So here's the thing. There's only 20% of those fats are butyrate.
Right.
20%. 80 or 60% is acetate, which is very similar. It's the precursor for acetyl-CoA. I mean, you have to do is put a coenzyme on it. You got acetyl-CoA, you know, or it's essential for it. I mean, it's what's the fuel that's required, and it's actually more widely transported into the brain than butyrate. Because it's smaller molecules, only 2 carbons, butyrate is 4, but it gets into the brain more readily. And then you got the propionate, which is another 20%, but most of it is acetate. And I'm wondering if you could give your comments on the likelihood that this is a misperception, and maybe the first few researchers who took a look at this had some prejudice or bias that's stuck because they were the first people that addressed it.
Sure. Yeah, I guess my thought process, I always put the most weight on empirical data, like what actually happened to real humans in real world conditions.
Yeah.
In terms of mental models, I always get suspicious when we think we found the one switch or the one trigger, or as you and I are speaking, we've got somewhere close to 10,000 biochemical pathways working in concert, and there are certainly, hit by a truck, that one thing was a big factor, but apart from all the rest. But by and large, with our chemistry, so many things are interconnected. So there's been just so many times where in your career, my career, we've seen researchers say, oh, this is the one thing. If we can just hack this one little thing, it'll all be okay. And then once more research is done, like, well, there's nuance. Like that thing is important in the context of other things. So yeah, I definitely do think that there's a huge benefit to a balanced gut flora. These short chain fats are really important. Many foods are known to help better the amount of these short chain fats. Is there one that's the only one that's most important? Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, and it's my normal approach is naturopathic, and you are an ND. We did mention that, but you're a licensed ND from a 4-year medical school. There's not that many of them in the U.S. and Canada. I think there's only 4. Is it 4 or 5 or 6 now? I have no idea in North America.
I think 6 is the correct count.
Okay. All right. So it's always changing that in new schools, but yeah, that's a small group, and NMDs, these are naturopathic medical doctors, not NDs. I think is that the best way to distinguish it, or is an NMD a professional who's got an MD and a naturopathic degree?
The difference is per state licensure. Some states offer broader scopes of practice and broader requirements.
Okay. So that gives you the NMD.
Correct.
Okay. Which essentially allows physicians who were trained at these institutions, 4-year institutions, many of them residency. Is it a requirement now for residencies?
In many states there is, and also there's specialty boards that have emerged.
Okay, that's good. And you have one of those specialty boards. You're an endocrinology specialized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I founded that board, and
yeah. So that's great. But anyway, there's the guiding principle, as I understand, one of the guiding principles of naturopathic medicine is nature doesn't make mistakes. Let's just follow the pattern, and maybe we'll get a clue and identify what the solution is. And so if you look at it, you got a 60% of acetate, 20 of butyrate, and 20% of propionate. Why is that? And that the clinicians who seek to address this are only given butyrate. It doesn't make sense. So and the reason I'm saying this is because the conventional way of giving butyrate is fatally flawed. It doesn't work. You can only get a very tiny fraction, probably low single digits of a % of the therapeutic oral dose you're giving. And yes, almost 100% of the rectal dose is given it goes into the rectum, but how much of it goes beyond the rectum? Not much. And you've got 10 feet. You're not certainly putting up there. And the only way you can get it up there right now is to put a colonoscope in. And that's not something you're going to want to do every day. No, not warranted. So there was no delivery system to do it. Well, I have a global patent now that delivers anything to the colon if we need to. And it escapes the stomach, high pH, or I'm sorry, very low pH, high acidity, low pH. And then it transits through the small intestine, which is about a 6-hour journey. And then it winds up in the colon. And the reason that's important, because if you release butyrate, you swallow it, and you don't release it in the colon, you release it in your stomach or your small intestine, you're going to have a lot of side effects. It is not pleasant, and it's not going to work. There's no benefit for having butyrate in your stomach or small intestine. None. Zero. Nada. There's no cells there that are going to use it. It's only going to cause problems. So it only works when it's in your colon. So I developed this delayed time release, and we have a global patent for it, to get beneficial obligate anaerobes, bacteria that only survive in the absence of oxygen. When they have oxygen, they're killed. It's a poison to them. Go figure. But these were like the primitive bacteria that the planet first evolved from, and they're still hanging around in our guts if we're healthy. Most of us are not healthy, so you don't have many of them. But if you're optimally healthy, you'll have a pretty wide variety, and these are considered the beneficials, and these are the ones that produce the short chain fats. So if you don't have them, you don't make them. So it would seem reasonable that putting those short chain fats back and to feed the cells that really, they're one of the few cells in the body that function on fatty acid oxidation. These epithelial cells in the colon that line the colon, and primarily colonocytes, and then they create that gut barrier so nothing leaks out. And if you give that butyrate back, the observation is that you can pretty much recover because those cells, because they have fuel again. Their fuel source disappeared when the beneficial bacteria disappeared. It's just such a complex interplay. So those beneficial bacteria were gone; they left. So this is one of the reasons why I developed a butyrate product. But and it's not out yet; it will be out shortly, and hopefully another month or two. But when I started reviewing this, I said, this doesn't make any sense. I just think because if you look at the literature, everyone says it's only butyrate, nothing else. That's a clear consensus, but I think the consensus is wrong. And I want to make another product that has just that ratio, 60% acetate, 20% propionate, and 20% butyrate. And we're going to actually look at what happens and do comprehensive testing to understand which one is. Because first of all, no one's been able to give butyrate therapeutically directly into the colon until now. So you couldn't do these tests before. So you really didn't have the capacity to do the research, but now we do. And I think that we're going to, my guess is that we're going to prove the consensus wrong on this.
That'll be fascinating to see.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. So now, one of the other things we talked about in our call was the astonishing relationship between thyroid hormones and estrogen, because I had mentioned to you that I find testing for estrogen hormones in the serum or the blood is a worthless test. It should not be offered. I personally believe that's almost criminal to offer that test because it provides no value, because estrogen is not stored in the blood. It's stored in the tissues. So it's going to give you a false information, and no information is worse than bad information.
That's a good
incorrect.
Quote.
Yeah. Or false information.
False is worse than none.
Yeah, it has to be, because you're going to make bad decisions and bad choices. And these, it's important because millions, tens of millions of postmenopausal women are making those choices based on that data, and it's flawed. It's wrong, and I think that's why it's dangerous. And I don't think those tests should be allowed unless you have some super subspecialist who's doing some exotic testing, because it's just dangerous for people to get that misinformation. So anyway. Go ahead.
Well, just briefly to that point, women are often treated as if low estrogen is a disease process, and they're, whether they're symptomatic or not, and they're tried to be brought back to a certain level of that. And that's very difficult with serum levels and not correlated with positive outcomes.
Well, I would contend it's not difficult at all. It's impossible. Yeah. And in fact, the problem is, if they were low estrogen, that'd be pretty good news. Problem is, almost every one of them are high estrogen. And you could prove it by the other hormone, prolactin, which is, I think, almost everyone should have. And we're creating a whole lab testing system, and prolactin is one of the mandatory tests that we'll be including in that, because it gives us an indication of your estrogen exposure, whether it's endogenous or it's through exogenous estrogen mimics like plastic and microplastics, which are pervasive in our environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when you see that, you can exactly see that go up. So when I discussed this, your view on prolactin and its influence on that, you gave me another astonishing information in that, oh, did you know, by the way, when you take exogenous thyroid hormones, it raises your prolactin levels. And that's precisely what happened to me. My prolactin was low, well, it wasn't low single digits. It was like 6, 7. And then it started to go up. I said, what? It made no sense. So I increased my prolactin. It didn't change, not prolactin, my progesterone, and it didn't change it until I've only taken it once now. So I don't know. I'm sure it'll go down. I think it did go down. It went down like 1 point in 2 weeks, but I was only off of it for 2 weeks. So why don't you share that connection there, the correlation?
Yeah. Basically, the connection is that you have a feedback loop by which the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to manage the other glands. And in the context of managing the thyroid, the signal to the hypothalamus, from the hypothalamus to the pituitary telling it to make more thyroid hormone, is the same signal that also causes the pituitary to make more prolactin. So when there's any type of thyroid resistance, then that can cause elevations. And with taking thyroid hormone from outside the body, there's so many things that happen to the body that are not linear. We talk about simple systems in science and complex systems. So I'm looking at the sky, as vast as our universe is, the movement of stars and planets and galaxies is actually a simple system. You can make basic equations and predict, you can send a man to the moon or do whatever else, have a satellite pass Pluto very closely. You can make massive predictions. But with complex systems, because they're self-regulating, you can't make these predictions like that. So when you give something from the outside of the body, like a thyroid hormone, you might make the body resist thyroid hormones to a greater degree. And you might see the opposite type effects emerge. You might see hypothyroid symptoms become more pronounced.
Yeah. It's just fascinating. And in this case, though, I don't think there's many clinicians who understand or use prolactin as a useful tool for the true measure of estrogen sensitivity. But would you agree? I just don't
I
think
would
that
agree.
knowledge is wide.
Well, and something just worth to share with the audience too. When we're talking about how the body uses hormones, it's not just about how much hormone is there. That's something that we can measure to some degree, but it's also about how the body's responding to them. And we know about a couple of levels of ways in which the body can adjust that response by receptor number, by receptor activity. But it's very common that when there's more than is needed, you can see the opposite type effects.
Yeah. So, and because you're an endocrinologist, you would have a really good one, because we've had that discussion too. There's so many specialties where the specialty is there's no need for it to exist, and there's some rare exotic cancer or something, because the 99% of the stuff they treat, they don't know how to treat. They don't understand the fundamental basic causes.
Well, in the case of my world in endocrinology, I totally agree. And the question is, thinking about the body as nature, as having wisdom, when do we intervene and when do we support it? When do we do things that are generally good and generally healthy? And when do we basically grab the steering wheel away from it? And if someone doesn't have a thyroid, they're missing a gland, they need intervention. There's just no debates about that.
100%. Yes. That's one of the few cases where they need a consultant.
Right. And those situations, however, are so rare. There's so many more cases to where levels can look quite abnormal, but there's a big difference between the body compensating and the body being unable to compensate. And they can look similar to the untrained eye.
Absolutely, yeah. So I want to get back to the prolactin, and I think it's so crucial to know, and I didn't understand that, because I was assuming that my estrogen exposure or plastic exposure had gone up, because that's the only reason where prolactin, but because that causes prolactin to increase. And I forget the mechanism there. I knew it at one time, but I forgot it. But it has something to do with the pituitary.
That thyroid binding globulin increases. That's one of the common threads of all of that.
Oh, does estrogen impact that too?
Yep.
Okay, run through that, because I forgot what the mechanism is.
Endogenous, exogenous estrogen, estrogenic compounds, xenoestrogens, phytoestrogens, they can cause a heightening of thyroid binding globulin, and that causes a compensatory hypothyroid response, and that can include heightened prolactin, heightened thyrotropin releasing hormone, and then heightened thyrotropin, heightened TSH.
Okay, so in this case, it's a good marker for estrogen or microplastic excess or xenoestrogen excess. So, but and if that was the cause, then you should be alarmed for sure. But in this case, it's for a different reason. So it's sort of like a false positive if you're taking thyroid hormones. And that's good. That's what I would view it as. It's a false positive. Still nothing great. And it's a suggestion that something's off. Either you have estrogen exposure or you have an excess source of iodine.
Yeah, so classic things that can affect that are just that someone starting or stopping hormone replacement, oral contraceptives, xenoestrogen exposure, abnormal responses to thyroid medications. These things can all affect that axis.
Yeah, but it's really interesting too, and I can't forget what it was. Oh, I think because I was really surprised my prolactin was relatively high. I was in the teens for sure when I first started measuring it. And once I started progesterone, it went down. So that, in my view, and I'd like to hear your feedback, I think that's pretty clear evidence that supports there's an estrogen connection in that context.
Yeah, and that is one thing that affects it.
Yeah. So that's something you can measure yourself. And beautiful thing about these things is that prolactin is not an expensive hormone to test for. It's relatively inexpensive. So it was in a testing company we're launching soon. We're definitely going to be offering it for under $10 a test. It's pretty, and that's a blood spot. You just prick your finger, put it in a card, and put it in the mail. So it's pretty easy. Yeah. So that's something you should know. So we're trying to make testing helpful again. Not that it has ever not been unhelpful, but the complexities, the cost, the inconvenience of it is so limiting. And is that most people don't use it not even every year.
Did we ever talk about the 5 rules for accurate thyroid labs?
No. So let's go over the 5 rules now.
Yeah. So often people will do thyroid labs repeatedly and get results that differ and scratch your head about why. And in many cases, they're just not testing in ways to get consistent results. So First big one is time of day. Thyroid hormones are circadian. They vary throughout the daily rhythm. The wonderful thing about blood spot tests is that it's much easier to observe these rules because you're not dealing with the schedule of some lab draw station where, which is a difficult thing. So time of day, between 6 to 9 a.m., you'll get pretty consistent results. If you compare that against results taken other times of the day, it'll be random. Fasting. So fasting and non-fasting states will also affect thyroid hormones pretty significantly. Vitamins that contain biotin. So now biotin is not a bad thing. It doesn't hurt your thyroid or disrupt that in normal amounts, but it changes how the chemicals respond in laboratory analysis. So you want a holiday of 3 days from sources of biotin. It's kind of odd because dietary biotin doesn't do this, but supplemental biotin can. So you want to break a couple of days from biotin supplements.
Are there other tests that biotin impacts?
About 300.
Really?
Yeah. I can forward you some data on that.
I didn't know that. That is wonderful to know.
Yeah, biotinidase enzymes are a big part of a lot of lab analysis, and just supplemental biotin can change the findings quite a bit.
Wow. I'm going to definitely integrate that into our requirement. You cannot take supplemental B vitamins, essentially, unless it doesn't have biotin.
A couple days before your labs. Just a couple days before the labs. Yeah, the data differs, but 3 days is clearly enough. So now those 3 apply to everyone. The next 2 apply to some people. The 4th one is thyroid medications. So you want to take your lab tests before taking thyroid medications that day. If you take your lab tests right within the first few hours of taking a thyroid medicine, you're going to get really goofy levels, especially for total T3, free T3, or free T4. And I could talk about the pharmacokinetics, but the ranges are calibrated for the baseline. So not the peak after a dose, but the low point of the 24-hour cycle, so before thyroid meds. And the last one for menstruating women, and this goes back to our talk about estrogen, prolactin, thyroid binding globulin. Women who are menstruating, they're going to get completely different labs at different parts of their menstrual cycle for their thyroid. So you want to measure in the first day of the period, we call day 1 for nomenclature, and average length of a period, 28, 30 days. So considering day 1 is the first day of menstrual flow, days 1 through 9 are fine, and days 20 through 28 are great. So the first several days, last several days, totally good. The middle portion, days 10 through days 19, you won't get consistent results. So yeah, the first part of the last part of the menstrual cycle are critical. So those are the 5 rules. And people often don't know those. And they have these things in all different configurations for one set of labs, and then a different configuration for another set. And that by itself can cause huge changes in the scores.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I was not aware of that at all. We'll need to input that into our system. Not so much because it definitely, I had thyroid tests initially into the standard testing that we were going to do, but after I talked to you, it's out, and we shifted it. We substituted the only 2 tests that the 2 tests I suggested to you are the only thyroid test we don't need is the antibody test, because there's a different way to treat the autoimmunity, and I did not understand. So now those are the only 2 tests that we do as a screen, are the thyroid antibody test. Oh, and I forgot to ask you, what was the percentage of people who have autoimmune thyroiditis who have normal thyroid antibodies?
Somewhere around half. So the way they've asked that question, because most people know they have thyroid disease by the antibodies, the way they asked that was by looking at people post hoc who had had thyroidectomies and had seen evidence of thyroid autoimmunity, and then went back beforehand and sent from their prior lab, saw how many of them had positive or negative thyroid antibodies. And when you've confirmed that someone does have thyroid autoimmunity by looking at their thyroid under a microscope, and then you go backwards, half of them never have had positive thyroid antibodies.
Wow. So with that information, I still think it makes sense to do a screen, but I would definitely be interested
It does.
in
In
your
many
feedback.
cases, someone will not know about that by any other way. And the antibodies themselves can cause symptoms regardless of the thyroid levels. So it's still worth screening for.
Yeah,
But if someone has
just because you have normal antibodies doesn't mean you don't have thyroid disease.
Yeah, if someone has abnormal thyroid function and normal thyroid antibodies, we still assume autoimmunity unless there's proven otherwise.
But here's the problem where as I mentioned earlier with the estrogen tests, sometimes tests can mess you up and they cause more harm than good. And I'm wondering, I've had that similar viewpoint now about normal thyroid testing with the thyroid hormone levels, that my whole viewpoint has just shifted. And I think there is a place for them, surely, but mostly it's about maybe 2% of what I thought it was. It's certainly not for screening. It's certain TSH is not for screening. And I want you to discuss this and tell me if you agree, of course. But it seems that just doing the clinical history that Broda Barnes and all the other clinicians did over 100 years ago, when they predated all this thyroid testing, and we're able to accurately identify these people, that if we use those, that's probably going to be good enough. I was fascinated with endocrinology. I didn't share this previously, but I did 2 3-month rotations at Cook County Hospital in Chicago with the endocrine department there, because it was just an enormous amount of pathology. And I remember from my training there that I'm pretty confident it's like almost no one dies of hypothyroidism. Why? Because you're so symptomatic. You absolutely are going to be seen by this issue. There's no way anyone misses that.
Well,
you get this.
A bizarre thing. I've actually seen people who have been athyrotic and not gone on medication, and certainly not thrived, and been very close to requiring emergency treatment. But it's surprising when you see even overt hypothyroidism, where TSH scores are in the 50s or hundreds, and the hormone levels are minimally measurable, like they're so far below range. The majority of people are asymptomatic. So it does matter, and it is a real thing, but the correlation between thyroid levels and symptoms is so much looser than people would ever imagine.
Yeah. It's just so. What's your position on this now? Do you think there's value of doing the thyroid hormone testing as a screen, or just the antibodies are sufficient, and rather than focus on the symptoms?
Yeah, the question is really coming down to what the treatment options are. And in the conventional world, the only treatment option is synthetic thyroid medications.
Right.
And if that were the only treatment option, that would change things. But given how powerful diet and lifestyle are, then there are other ways to help that. And just as a quick screen to correlate with symptoms, the antibodies have much more value. There are people who have negative antibodies who have overt hypothyroidism. They're not always symptomatic. There may be health risks that correlate with that, and medications aren't the only option. So there can be some value in testing, but in terms of just screening for overall level of explaining symptoms, the antibodies are much more predictive.
Yeah, yeah. So glad we settled on that. So you had written a book, The Thyroid Reset Diet, and interestingly, I wrote a book too, Your Guide to Cellular Health, and we both came to the same conclusion that we were going to identify foods red, green, and yellow. Great minds think alike, right? So yeah, unfortunately, mine are not thyroid safe at all. And in my view, yours are not metabolically safe because some of your green foods are seasoned nuts, which I think are fine if you're metabolically healthy and have really low levels of linoleic acid, and that is probably less than 1 in 10,000 people, maybe lower than that.
Mm.
So so I would be really, really careful about using seasoned nuts. Certainly no seed oils. And when you're off of them for 6 months, I think you can go have at it. It's probably okay in small quantities because they're not intrinsically dangerous. They're only in dangerous in the context of the excessive, radically, exponentially excessive amounts that are in most people's bodies. Because it's not like an almond is going to kill you. No, but it's not. It's only going to push your health backwards in the context of all the stored linoleic acids in your adipose tissue. Get that out, you're good. And then still don't use crazy amounts because we're never designed to eat a pound of almonds at a time. There's no way. It doesn't. You never ever do that in nature. So maybe a few, okay, and that's fine. And walnuts, whatever. But you don't need many of them. So that's one of my disagreements. And then my food, you cannot use my red, green, yellow food system for thyroid because it has lots of high thyroid food, high iodine foods on there. And this, I want you to, this is one of the astonishing things about this, the really I learned is that even really healthy, ideally almost optimal foods in nature can be contaminated with this perversion of our introduction of these synthetic and toxic, mostly toxic materials like iodine into the food supply, which shouldn't have been there, but is there, and it contaminates these healthy foods. So why don't you comment on that?
Sure. One high level thought is that I like to think about dietary interventions as being in a couple of categories, one of which is what's generally a healthy diet overall. And there's some good broad guidelines one can make about that. And then there's times in which a diet can be a very specific tool for a very specific situation. And our bodies, generally, the things that are good for any part of us are almost never bad for other parts of us, but there's exceptions. You mentioned an interesting thing about how parts of our intestinal tract that are important parts of our bodies, they die when exposed to oxygen. Now, that's not typical. We need oxygen in many other parts of our body very critically.
Yeah.
So yeah, our needs are not the same in every compartment. And then even more so when there are particular disease states that can change even further. So when someone has thyroid disease, they have needs for this part of their body that are distinct from their global health. And that's what I really wanted to focus on. I'm not saying this was the diet for everyone for all reasons, but in the context of chronic adult autoimmune thyroid disease, these specific things can be very powerful. And one can still follow whatever else is important for their global health or other goals. But I wanted to make it just really focused and simple.
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize again that it's not that hard following a low iodine diet. I mean, some people may find it troublesome, but it's pretty straightforward. And it requires a lot of diligence, like most implementations, because, as I said, there's so many healthy foods that you have to be really careful about, like milk, especially raw milk from Amish farmers. If these Amish farmers don't understand that there should not be using iodine wash on the breast, it's not a good idea. So, but you have to do that due diligence, or even the feeds. Many of these animals, as when Ashley was on Earth, the iodine is in the feed they're giving their animals. The veterinary scientists are even more confused than the nutrition human scientists. So they're contaminating everyone's food supply with these attempts at preventive medicine, which is beyond foolishness. I mean, they've done it with iodine. They've certainly done it with fluoride, and a lot of people would argue against it, but they have. And thankfully, and hopefully, Bobby Kennedy will get that out of at least at a federal level, get that banned. And then they've done it with iron. And then, in an effort because they thought it was harmless, they also did it with mercury. So they put this into our systems, and it just wreaks havoc with our biology.
A couple of our big principles in naturopathic medicine are that the first one is the healing power of nature. It works very powerfully. And the second one is do no harm. And all too often we think we can do better and we can intervene in some way. And you're citing exact examples of that hubris causing problems.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just astonishing. So you're trained in endocrinology, and we've pretty much beat that thyroid up to death now. So what are in my viewpoint, there's one other, maybe even bigger one that even more people have problems with, and that is diabetes. That's really the 1 and 2, right? Diabetes and thyroid, and then others. But can you give us your take on diabetes? I suspect we're like 100% aligned on this one, but we have not previously discussed it.
Well, so back to our prior discussion about the fuel partitioning, I would just throw it in that same category. So we've got all these parts of the body that we store fuel, and one of the more harmful places for fuel to accumulate is the bloodstream. And that's what diabetes is. Diabetes mellitus is just sweet urine as far as the actual name meaning. So there's so much fuel that's built up, it's spilling out into the urine. And so when the body is metabolically healthy and storing fuel in safer places, such as glycogen and triglyceride in good balances, then we see that stable. But if there's poor metabolism of fuel, excess of fuel states, inability to burn it properly, then we see it accumulate in the organs. Fascinating thing, but there was one study in which they took people that had rather advanced type 2 diabetes, and they had them do a brief reset process of lowering food content, but still maintaining nutrients. And the visible signs of changes on the beta cells in the pancreas, they could change. You could see a CT before and after, and you could actually reverse that. And they showed that the excess of about 2 grams, like 2 paper clips worth of fat within the pancreas, that's the difference between diabetes and non-diabetes. So it's just this tiny fuel excess in one little place. So this is just one more example of that. And we define that by the measurable excess of fuel in the bloodstream.
Yeah, I think you can, for sure. I think that's a symptom and not the cause, though.
Sure. It's a cause of this body being metabolically unhealthy and not burning fuels properly.
Or poisoned.
Sure.
It's poison, I certainly in my book.
Well, and that's one of the ways in which the body cannot burn fuel well. It's simply not able to because of these various toxicants.
Yeah, because I believe that glucose, and this is not my innovation. I stole this one from Ray Peat, because for 30 years I disparaged this man, not widely and certainly publicly, but I didn't think he knew what he was talking about. He was just some whacked out biologist. Little I know, he was the greatest health teacher of the 20th century, and helped us. He was the first guy that understood these seed oils were so dangerous. He got his PhD in estrogen in 1982, and really was he and Katarina Dalton were one of the first people that helped people understand the importance of progesterone, long before John Lee did, like 20 years later. So where was I going with this? Oh, through Pete's work, I've understood that glucose is the ultimate fuel for the mitochondria, and it's certainly not in all cells of the body, as we discussed earlier. The colonic cells, they require fats. Your heart cells require fats. It's a fatty acid oxidation machine. And if you don't get them, it's not going to work. But most of the other cells don't require the fats that well. Can they use them? Sure. Is that great to have the ability to? 100%. But if you decide that you're going to go on a vacation and not eat carbs for 3 or 4 years, there's a darn bad consequence, because this is such a confusing area for most people, because they're confusing the people at the scene of the crime, which is, in this case for diabetes, is glucose. Clearly it's glucose. If glucose is there, if all you got to do is stop eating glucose, that is absolutely perfectly rational and logical, but nothing could be further from the truth.
And this brings up one really common way in which what happens in the body doesn't really go along with just common sense knowledge or what seems logical. So the glucose in the bloodstream, you would think that, you have a meal and that's where the glucose comes from. There's now been studies showing that can that can differentiate glucose that we create and release from glucose that we ingest. You can actually distinguish that in clinical research. And with diabetics, when you look at their blood sugar levels after a meal, their postprandial glucose elevations, and you actually differentiate that, it turns out that over 80% of their elevations of glucose after a meal didn't come from the meal. It came from their body over-releasing and overreacting. So yeah, it's not just glucose in, glucose up. There's much more complexity than that.
Yes, yes, it is. So I don't know where I was going with this, but the low carb. So many people assume that, and I was one of them. It'd be because I thought Pete didn't know what he was talking about, and he wasn't involved in my decision for doing this because I dismissed him decades earlier, his work. But then it came around, and I started opening my eyes and realizing that, boy, this is a pretty serious misunderstanding from my perspective, and when you reduce your carbs, it gets into another area, which is endocrinology. Your body's response is to liberate stress hormones, specifically cortisol, but also adrenaline and glucagon.
Well, glucose is non-negotiable for the body. It's just where it comes from.
Yes.
You can get it from the diet, or you can get it by using cortisol to break down your muscle tissue.
Yeah. And that's it. That's a stress hormone. And there's no, as I understand it, certainly if you have a different perspective, please share it, because you've got broader context than I do in this area. But there's not much difference between cortisol activated through the need for creating glucose in your blood versus emotional cortisol released from emotional distress.
100%.
Is there a difference?
100%. Not at all.
Same molecule.
Yep.
Same molecule.
Yep. And not only that, but further, it's the global impact. It's how many total drivers there are for cortisol production at a given point in time. The mental, emotional stressors, the environmental toxicants fit on this, the disruptions of blood sugar, the body's inability to maintain a healthy circadian cycle, control of electrolytes. The composite of all those things are what drives the total stress response.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this is so many people don't get that, and they can't sleep. They're on a low carb diet, and they that's just a hormetic effect. You got to get used to it.
Cortisol, first and foremost, is a glucocorticoid. It's a glucose regulating hormone, and especially there's a circadian rhythm.
That's an important point. And every one of us learned that in med school, right? But how many of us remember it?
The circadian rhythm is we make a bulk of it in the morning to wake us up, and then we shut that off as the day goes along. But if our carbohydrate intake is far too low, we have to keep making cortisol to artificially make glucose out of muscle, and we can't have a good circadian rhythm. We can't sleep well.
Yeah. So what is your view of the ideal glucose intake per day in grams? My belief is about 200, 250, depending on your size and exercise and movement. But what's your take on it?
Totally a reasonable amount. Somewhere around probably at the bottom end, a third, 40% or so of calories. Top end somewhere around half, a little more. But the gram numbers you cited are within that for most adults.
Yeah, and when you guys going low, certainly, it's most low carbers are less than 50 grams. Some goes below 20.
And so not only do we see cortisol disruptions, but we see thyroid disruptions as well from this. And it all ties in.
Mm-hmm. And I would assume testosterone.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. So what's your take on testosterone?
Well, so a big part of just aging and health is, of course, maintaining body composition. And the funny thing, there's just a total, like any other hormone, there's the total amount there, but there's so much more depth to it in terms of how we respond to it, how we signal to it. I'm not one who's really big on hormone replacement across the board for all people. I think healthy people generally have more reasonable amounts, but I don't see as compelling data that manipulating levels is the same as achieving healthy levels. And I'd say that for hormones across the board.
Interesting. So I've taken a little different position when it comes to progesterone. And the justification is that we have such a massive exposure to plastics that's essentially unavoidable. You cannot escape plastic exposure. It's pervasive. No matter how assiduous you are and conscious and obsessive about avoiding it, you're going to get it. It's just there. Now, you can radically reduce it, but it's there. So I kind of justify that, especially using prolactin level when you're not on thyroid hormones. If it's elevated, to recommending that people consider that? And what's your view on that?
Well, so in terms of interventions, I always think differentiate mechanisms and outcomes. And this is back to the whole simple systems like galaxies and complex systems like weather or the economy or the human body. So we can always have ideas about mechanisms and why what might do what. And those can be great starting places. But I'll put more weight on outcomes. And outcomes are never perfect. There's always ways in which there's biases. No studies are ever perfect. But towards the goal of being less wrong, the closer we can approximate the actual outcome, the closer we can say what will happen with a complex system. We don't have simple formulas for that. In the case of progesterone, for example, a lot of clinical benefits for that. Nothing in terms of outcome, no intervention is ever perfectly harmless. There are studies now saying that longer term use of even oral or topical micronized progesterone more than 5 years may correlate with heightened breast cancer risks. So yeah, things can all have their place.
Interesting.
Interventions are never totally harmless. Anything that can have effects can have side effects, and we only know about that from just larger outcome studies.
Yeah, and what would you look at to identify a warning of a potential concern?
Anytime you're intervening on the body for long. Anytime you're intervening for long periods of time, I always put a lot of caution for that. If it's absolutely necessary because the body can't do something, that's a whole different situation.
Okay, that's interesting. So something I have to cogitate on that one for a while. That's something to reflect, because it's hard to argue with that philosophy. It really is.
There are times in which there is a net benefit to intervening, but I just really want good justification and good evidence that there's more benefit than there is harm for that.
Yeah. I think the justification for most, it seems the lesser of two evils because of as I said, the microplastic exposure, but more importantly, the high cortisol levels they have. And cortisol by itself is not without complications or damage. And that could definitely take you out prematurely for sure. So it might be the lesser of two potentially pernicious interventions or factors.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that depends on the details of one particular situation. Yeah.
But I agree. I'm not a fan of testosterone augmentation. Many guys are certainly doing it. TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, but TRT and ERT I think should be out. But many people don't know that I was actually a paid consultant by the drug companies in the mid '90s. They would fly me to different conferences to lecture to physicians about estrogen replacement therapy. I bought it hook, line, and sinker.
I was in that world, in the natural side of that world, like the anti-aging side of that world around that time frame. And over time, the more I kept seeing data about it's not the same as the body doing it by itself. And there's always some outcome.
Yeah. The Women's Health Initiative came out in the early 2002. And really put an end to much of that, to the dismay of many natural-oriented physicians, and claiming that the WHI was mistaken. What a grievous error, mistake, and just refusing to acknowledge that there's some danger here, which is sad. But nevertheless, there's a lot of controversy on this area. Many well-respected areas in space, as you well know, take that position.
Yep.
Yeah. So I tend not to disagree, and that sounds like you don't either.
I don't. Yeah, again, I think that's heavy-handed interventions are things we taken very cautiously.
Yeah. Well, so from your broad perspective on endocrinology over the years, what have we covered? Most of the major things you see and like to comment on and to give people advice?
I guess just one small point that you opened discussion up about diabetes, and one thing that's worth mentioning is about the idea about changing a marker, changing a surrogate marker versus changing an outcome. So in medicine, there's a lot of ways we can change blood markers. Like in the case of thyroid hormones, we can totally manipulate them with thyroid medications, but that's not the same as someone having that state on their own. And it's similar in the case of a lot of situations in which medications are given for metabolic disease or chronic disease risk. You can force blood sugar down, but you don't have the same risks as a non-diabetic person. And we see that when we look at outcomes about how many people you have to treat with medication to see one less heart attack, for example, the numbers are always pretty bad. And so a way in which people are often falsely lulled into security is told that if you're on this medication, now your levels are normal, now you're okay. It's not the same thing. It's not that. And the drawback is people are now no longer thinking that they need to do things like pursue their diet or consider supplementation or do other steps because they think that the problem is solved. But yeah, you can mask a lot of problems with medications. It's not always the same as fixing things.
Yeah, so I want to pivot to a question I overlooked and just recalled now that we previously discussed on our call, and that is a gland very close to the thyroid called the parathyroid gland. Mm-hmm. And normal calcium levels in the blood, serum calcium, are perceived to be, and I think this is ionized calcium if I'm not mistaken. I think there might even be a corrective form or calculation for that, but is between 9.7 and 10.3. That's considered the normal range. And
most labs will call like mid eights to upper eights the bottom end of the normal range.
Okay. Maybe the lab I was using was off. So that's the bottom end. And then the top end is like 10.3 conventionally?
10.3, 10.5. You'll see them in that range.
Okay. So your contention is, from your experience and observation, this is incorrect. And that any values over 9.8 suggest a problem with the parathyroid. So can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. Parathyroid specialists have identified this for quite some time, and not all values above 9.8 are always problematic, but recurrent values above 9.8 do warrant investigation, especially if someone is symptomatic. And the exacting balance of calcium in the bloodstream affects a huge range of symptoms. The mnemonic in medical school was the stones, bones, thrones, moans, and psychic overtones. So you can get kidney stones, gallstones, joint calcification, bone thinning, bone loss. The thrones refers to frequent bowel movements, frequent urination, also digestive complaints, the groans and psychic overtones. So vague things like fatigue, anxiety, chronic pain throughout the body. A lot of stuff can be affected by subtle changes in calcium metabolism. And the simplest thing occurs when calcium is blatantly elevated and someone goes on to get investigated for a reason for that. Sadly, I've had tons of examples of people that I've seen who had blatant elevations of calcium that were just deferred, told that it was fine, you don't have to worry about that. Elevated calcium always needs an explanation. It's most commonly parathyroid disease, but when it's not, it's often a hidden cancer or it's kidney disease. It's never a minor thing. Now, the wrinkle is that you can have normal calcium, but if it's recurrently high normal, so recurrently 9.8 or greater, that is worth investigating if someone has symptoms. And if someone has that high normal calcium and their parathyroid hormones are not on the lower end of the range, that shows there's something off. When the system works well, the parathyroid should downregulate when calcium's high normal, but in many cases they do not.
Yeah, the concern that I have with this approach, though, is if you get in the conventional model and you order the PTH and it's abnormal, well, there is nothing in the conventional model that will treat parathyroidism unless you get into a system that will essentially continue to monitor you, do a scan on your parathyroids or a biopsy, and then they will remove it. They have no cure, none, zero, nada. They do not understand biology in any way, shape, or form. So I think understanding that is good if you recognize that there is great harm in the conventional medicine system, that they will damage you, if not kill you, not intentionally.
If there were a better treatment, I'd be all for that, and maybe you'll come across that. I'd love to see that. If someone's choice is being untreated versus having one, so typically there's 4 parathyroids. There is a lot of anatomical variation for how many there are and where they're located, but most people, when there's an abnormality, it's one of those 4, which can be identified. The one can be taken out, the other 3 can take over. They're better off than being untreated. And again, if there's some way that surgery is not needed, I'd be all for that.
Right. But if they're going to try to take all your thyroid glands out, but I would counter with get a copy of your Guide to Cellular Health, increase your mitochondrial cellular energy production. You have a lot more ATP, get sun, reduce your toxic poisons that you're getting almost every day, and then see what happens to your parathyroid gland.
And I would support that, saying that this situation is one that rarely has that major urgency where you couldn't take a few months and just watch and see if you didn't have some positive response.
And usually that's what it takes. I think I want to share, I might have her on to interview her, the head of my research and development team to produce new products. She has been with us for many years, over a decade, and knows my work and knew that I was a really staunch promoter of avoiding seed oils. And she had gained weight over time, but more concerningly to her personally was a history of 15 years of monthly migraines every time. We would knock her off for 3 days, 3 days every month for 15 years. And so I encouraged her to go on a low thyroid diet. Not thyroid, low iodine, no, a low linoleic acid diet. And she tried, and it worked somewhat, but not really well. And she still had the migraines. But she was taking she had only gotten down to 8 grams a day. So then I inspired her to get more obsessive about it and get it down to 2 grams a day, and also put her a little bit of aspirin and progesterone, because menstrual migraines are almost always related to estrogen excess, and progesterone balances it pretty well. And literally 2 days ago, she texted me and said, "This is the first time in 15 years I've been without a migraine for 30 days.
That's great.
Yeah. And she's losing weight. Has not been able to do it, and wanted to consistently go on low carb and low calories, and, it's not going to work. So and she's a really smart woman, and she's been in my employ for a long time, and she knows this works. So it was the reason I was so astonished by that is that someone at that level still had trouble doing this, and because they don't have the confidence, they don't know the requirement that's needed to make a dent. These are very serious biological demands, and if you don't meet these demands, your body is not going to respond. It does not respond just because you think it or want it. There is very specific consequences and very specific thresholds that need to be reached. If you don't get it. You don't get what you want to. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just delighted that we can have this conversation, and that you're such a great, fantastic resource. And I think anyone who doesn't benefit from our interviews and your knowledge has some serious issues going on there, because there's a solution for almost everyone there. But if there isn't, if someone has some complex case that you don't know, then I couldn't recommend more highly Dr. Alan Christianson. And why don't you give us your contact information again?
Sure. drchristianson.com, DR, and then IANSON. Easy to find online.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Anything else you'd like to mention?
Just to add on to your most recent point, almost all things can get better when the body's given half a chance and given the right fuel, the blocks are taken away. It's amazing how much can get better. So just don't give up on that. Keep listening to Joe and keep trying things. And maybe you didn't get to that threshold, but know that the body has this amazing capacity. Yeah,
the central theme in my book is that you can basically reverse almost every disease as long as you're not that far down the path, because at some point it does become irreversible. You just don't have enough cellular energy production capacity left, because you've just done so much damage. It's like sometimes it's irreversible, but that is fortunately the pretty rare exception. Almost everyone, unless they're a week or two away from dying, can turn around. That's been my experience. I don't know if you've had a similar experience, but I'm just amazed at the regenerative capacity of biology. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, and for all your work, and keep up the good work.
Likewise.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, hit the like and subscribe button so you can get more videos that can help you and your family take control of your health.